One morning in mid-November 2011, Brogan Rafferty was at school in Akron, Ohio. Looking out the window, the 16-year-old was wondering about his future after, that morning, someone unexpected had come talk to him, and the conversation had left him feeling somewhat sad but also, in a way, relieved. Finally, the bell rings, time to go home. As he was leaving, he saw a girlfriend of his in the hallway. They had dated briefly in the past and were still very close. He took her aside and said, "I'll be gone for a while." Then gave her a little kiss and left. The girl found it to be strange. After all, Brogan hadn't been himself for quite some time. It was evident to everyone who knew him. He had started drinking heavily, isolating himself more and more. It seemed like he was completely detached from reality, a mere shadow of the person he once was. What Brogan's friends didn't know of yet was the dark secret that weighed on him like a boulder. A secret he shared with the one person he'd been seeing almost every single day for the past few months. 52 years old preacher and family friend, Richard Beasley. Richard was born in Akron in 1959, and his childhood was all but easy. His father was an alcoholic, and when he drank, he became verbally and physically abusive. Due to the difficult situation at home, Richard decided to focus on studying, where he showed real promise, being an especially bright kid. However, after graduating high school and moving to Texas, his life took a downturn, as his rough upbringing followed him, leading to an adult life in which petty crime was his main livelihood. As a result, in 1985 he was arrested and sentenced to jail for burglary. 4 years later, Richard, now 30 years old, was released and returned to Akron, where he resumed his everyday life trying to keep on the straight and narrow. A few months later, he got married to a woman named Tina, whom he met at a biker event, and in 1992 became a father to baby Tonya. For a few years, the couple enjoyed a peaceful life. Richard was a good husband to Tina and a loving father to Tonya, and had apparently found honest and steady work in a friend's manufacturing business. Unfortunately, despite how he made it look, it soon was clear that he still hadn't moved on from his old ways, when he once again was arrested in 1996 for burglarizing homes and dealing weapons, and sentenced to 7 more years in prison. Realizing that Richard wasn't the man she always thought he was, Tina left him. But despite the divorce, the man remained a big presence in his daughter Tonya's life, seeing her every month when she visited him in jail. This time, the years he spent behind bars had a big effect on Richard's outlook on life. He spent most of his time reading the Bible and reflecting on himself, and was a completely new man when he was released in 2004. In fact, in prison he had found God, and now wanted to dedicate his life to helping the needy. To do so, he became a chaplain at a local church, and spent most of his days working with recovering drug addicts, alcoholics, and prostitutes. His daughter would later recall how, every Friday, she would help him serve hot meals to the less fortunate. His charitable work didn't go unnoticed by the locals, who were very much impressed by his so radical departure from his old criminal ways, and soon Richard was one of the most well-respected members of the community. It was during those years that he became very close to Brogan Rafferty. Brogan was Richard's best friend's son and had sadly grown up in a broken family. His mother Yvette had been in and out of the house since becoming a drug addict, and his father Michael, although he loved his son very much, struggled with his situation as a single parent, and as a result could often be pretty rough, aside from the fact that he was away for work most of the time. As a result, Brogan was basically left to raise himself since he was a little boy, and had always looked at his father's friend Richard as a second, wiser and more rational father figure, establishing with him a sort of uncle-nephew relationship. He was the person Brogan turned to for help every time his mother disappeared, and overall was always there to offer counseling to help a young boy overcome the many challenges he was faced with on a daily basis. Just as everything seemed to be moving in the right direction, Richard's work in the community came to a sudden stop in 2008, after he got involved in a car accident that left him debilitated for some time. When he finally recovered, he found himself with permanent injuries and pain, and started taking heavy medication to which he soon became addicted. Nevertheless, something good eventually came out of an otherwise tragic situation, in the form of a substantial amount of insurance money the man received for the injuries he sustained. With the money, Richard decided to open a halfway house for recovering drug addicts and prostitutes whom, thanks to his now quite long history as a minister, the local justice system felt safe releasing into his care to be rehabilitated. For the next 2 years, Richard continues with this charitable work until, in February 2011, police officers showed up at his house with a warrant for his arrest. Once again, the man's true colors were revealed, to the shock of the local community. As it turned out, soon after opening the halfway house, Richard had realized that he could make a lot of money by hiring the recovering addicts to sell drugs on his behalf, and send the prostitutes to work the streets, keeping them addicted and threatening them with the prospect of being sent back to prison if they didn't obey. His criminal enterprise had continued to thrive until some of the women decided they had enough of him and went to the police. After being arrested, Richard remained in jail until July 2011, when he was finally able to post bond and was released, with his next court date coming up in August. Desperate and determined to avoid any more prison time, the man devised a wicked plan to raise money and disappear. Only he couldn't do it alone. He still suffered from the injuries caused by the car accident, and knew that to carry out his plan he would have needed some muscle. So he went straight to the person he knew he could control the easiest, 16 years old Brogan Rafferty. He didn't explain in detail what he planned to do, but Brogan was eager to help him and didn't bother asking too many questions. The first thing the two did was get in Richard's car and begin driving around the Akron, looking for a very specific kind of person, whom they eventually found in a man by the name of Ralph Geiger. So they approached him and Richard offered him a job. He explained he owned a decent-sized plot of land in southern Ohio and needed someone to go live on the property and take care of the few animals he had. This offer sounded like music to Ralph's ears. He'd been hit tremendously hard by the 2008 recession, lost his job, and now being over 50 years old, couldn't find anyone interested in offering him some work. So, even the small amount of $300 per week Richard was willing to pay sounded like a great deal, considering that he would be allowed to live in a trailer on the property for free. He immediately accepted the offer. At this point, Richard told him, "Alright then, let's go there right now so I can give you a tour of the property and show you where you'll be staying and what you'll have to do." The three men got in the car and started driving south. It was August 8th. After a few hours, they finally reached their destination, in a wooded area about 100 miles south of Akron. They got out of the car and started walking, until Richard said he realized that they were on the wrong path, so they all turned around to go back towards the car. But as soon as Ralph turned his back on Richard, the latter pulled out a gun and shot him point blank in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Witnessing this scene left Brogan in total shock. He had convinced himself that the job offer was real and that they were simply going to look at the property. Richard shouted at him, "Hey, snap out of it. Go back to the car and get a shovel." Then, while Brogan was digging a shallow grave, the killer searched the victim's body and retrieved his driver's license, other ID, and the little money the man had on himself. As soon as they were done burying Ralph's body, the two got back in the car, where Richard immediately said to Brogan, "I know your mother, I know your sister. I'll kill them both if you say anything to anyone." When they returned to Akron, Richard immediately got to work on the second phase of his plan. He dyed his hair and cut his beard to match that of Ralph Geiger. Then he disposed of his real ID and started living a new life impersonating his victim. Later that month, when he didn't show up in court, the judge issued a warrant for his arrest. However, despite now being a wanted man, in the following weeks things seemed to take a strong turn in Richard's favor. Using Ralph's identity, he was able to get an apartment and find a job at a local manufacturing facility, and, for a little while, he carried on with his new life. This was until he quit a couple weeks later. The job he had required some physical work and, due to his injuries, he couldn't do it. Also, considering the man's history, he probably didn't have the inclination to stick with an honest employment for too long. Being now unemployed and needing money, he came up with a new and improved version of his plan. He remembered that, a few years back, his daughter had set up for him a Craigslist account, which at the time he needed to sell some furniture he didn't use. This time, he posted an ad with the same offer he made Ralph Geiger, to take care of a piece of land in southern Ohio for $300 a week, specifying that the ideal candidate would be someone over the age of 50 and with no family, which is someone he could dispose of without anyone noticing. His plan was to lure men to an isolated area, then kill them and sell their belongings for money. After he posted his ad, it didn't take long before Richard was being flooded with dozens of requests. In a time of economic crisis, an offer like his own was everything lots of people were looking for. Going through the applicants, Richard eventually found someone who appeared to him to fit perfectly with his murderous plans. A man by the name of David Pauly, 51 years old. He was an ideal candidate as he had no kids and had recently divorced from his wife, so he would be bringing with him literally everything he owned. When he received the news that he'd been selected for the job, David felt that things had finally started moving in the right direction. He could now quit sleeping on his brother's couch and move on with his life. First thing he did was to call his sister to let her know that he found a job. Then he loaded his stuff on a truck and left for Ohio. On October 23rd, David Pauly met with Richard and Brogan, who posed as Richard's nephew, at a restaurant in Akron. After having grabbed a quick bite to eat, the trio got in Richard's car and began heading south. It didn't take long before they reached a remote wooded area where, just like the first time, Richard led his victim on a trail out of sight, before shooting him as soon as he got the chance. Then, while Brogan dug a shallow grave, he searched David's pockets for anything of value. When the two returned to Akron a few hours later, Richard took possession of David's truck and everything it contained. For the next few days, the man lived off the couple $1,000s he'd made selling David's stuff. However, his addiction to painkillers was severe and forced him to spend big on drugs. As a result, he blew through all the money in just a couple weeks and soon was back online looking for his next victim. His eyes fell on 48-year-old Scott Davis, who needed to move to Ohio to be closer to his elderly mother, and so was looking for a job in the area. What made him particularly interesting to Richard was the fact that he would be bringing with him several computers, TVs, guns, as well as Harley-Davidson motorbike and several pieces of landscaping equipment. All pretty valuable stuff that Richard was very much looking forward to steal and sell. After they reached an agreement, Scott loaded all his belongings in a trailer and headed to Ohio, where on November 6 he met with Richard and Brogan for breakfast. After breakfast, the three men piled in Richard's car and headed for the woods. About 8 hours later, an exhausted and bloody Scott Davis emerged from the forest next to an isolated farmhouse. He immediately ran to the front door and started banging on it, calling for help. After some convincing, the homeowners finally agreed to let him in and contact the local authorities. When the police showed up, Scott explained that he had responded to a job offer on Craigslist, and a few hours prior he had gone with his future employer and his nephew to see the piece of land he would be tasked with managing. When they reached the location, they got out of the car and started walking on a narrow path, until Scott heard a sound he recognized as that of a gun being cocked. The man had just enough time to turn around and raise his arm to protect himself before Richard shot him. Luckily for Scott, the bullet only hit his arm, not causing any fatal damage. He immediately took off, running for his life, and found a place to hide underneath some branches. When, 7 hours later, he felt safe that no one was still looking for him, he gathered all the strength he had left and went looking for help. When the sheriff on the scene heard this story, it seemed so far-fetched he didn't believe him. He was convinced that Scott was actually a drug dealer, and the gunshot wound was the result of a deal gone bad. It was only when Scott showed them the ad on Craigslist and the email exchange he had with the man known to him as Jack that law enforcement finally realized that he was telling the truth. Over the following few days, Scott's story started making the news both locally and nationally. A woman in Maine read about it and it really struck a chord with her. The ad on Craigslist, the farmland in southern Ohio, it all sounded worryingly similar to what her brother David Pauly had told her about the job offer he received. Not being able to get in touch with him, she immediately contacted Akron police. Having received this new information about David Pauly's disappearance, Authorities went back to the area in which Scott Davis had been shot, and eventually found Davis' body in a shallow grave nearby. The discovery of a second grave, empty this time, urged the investigators to ramp up their efforts to find the perpetrator of the crime before he could strike again, realizing they were dealing with a serial killer. And in fact, just as authorities worked on revealing his identity, Richard was already luring his next victim, 47 years old Tim Kern. Tim had been a DJ most of his life until he was let go by the nightclub he worked for. Having spent the following few years landing odd jobs here and there, he was now desperate to find steady work to support his kids. As he always did, Richard invited his victim to a restaurant in Akron for a fake job interview, in order to gather information about what the man possessed that he could steal. And so, on the morning of November 13, 2011, Tim Kern sent a quick "I love you" text message to his kids, before meeting with Richard and Brogan for breakfast. When questioned by Richard about his financial situation, Tim explained that he owned a few electronic products, like a laptop and a flat-screen TV, but that he had left them at home for his kids to use. On himself, that morning, he only had $5. Angered by the answer and annoyed by the waste of time, Richard decided to still go ahead with the murder, despite not having any financial motive. Only this time, he spared himself the long journey south, and told Brogan to stop in a wooded area behind an abandoned mall on the outskirts of Akron. Meanwhile, authorities had gotten hold of the surveillance footage from the restaurant in which Richard and Brogan had met with Scott Davis, and it didn't take long for them to realize that the person introducing himself as Jack was in fact Richard Beasley, the fugitive they've been looking for since August. Then, tracing the IP address from which the Craigslist ad was posted, investigators were led to a house in Akron. When confronted by the police, the homeowner said, "I don't know this Richard Beasley. I've been renting a room to a guy named Ralph Geiger." It was then that investigators realized that the suspect was actually impersonating his victim. Using the telephone number provided by the landlord, authorities were able to precisely pinpoint Richard's location. He was on the same block, casually walking down the street. A couple minutes later, he was surrounded by law enforcement and taken into custody. In the following days, police officers went to Brogan's school to question him about his involvement, and eventually arrested him as well. In the end, an unrepentant Richard Beasley was convicted of charges including murder, kidnapping and robbery, and sentenced to death. As for Brogan, despite only being 16 years old, he was tried as an adult for his involvement, and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 70 years. At the trial, he tried to make amends, apologizing to the victims' families.
And I think that if I've been through hell and back, as I believe I have, they must be living.
Asked why he never turned on Richard or tried to interfere with his plans, Brogan said, "To me, he had always been a mentor and a role model. It all went out the window when he killed Mr. Geiger, and I realized that, sooner or later, he would have no longer found me useful and killed me as well. But at least, as long as I kept him pleased and didn't give him any trouble, there was still a chance he wouldn't go out of his way to kill my family after I was gone. I chose them over me. Even now, I can't really complain about spending my entire life in prison. I'm supposed to be dead anyway."